There I go. Welcome, everyone. It is the Sunday after elections, November 8th. We welcome Ben Zeller, our own Ben Zeller. And Ben is an associate professor of religion. He spoke to us last year, and I asked him today to bat cleanup and what's next. And obviously, Ben was, working until recently. I mean, yesterday, everything has been in such flux. I felt bad for him, but if anyone can do it, he can do it. So Ben, take it away.
All right, thank you, Vanessa, and thanks for having me. Yeah, Vanessa and I were trading emails. Was it Wednesday or Thursday? And she said, "What are you going to say?" And I said, "I don't know. Give me a couple of days to think about it." So I spent yesterday going through a lot of the poll data. So what I'm going to talk about, and I think we can probably leave about half the time for just discussion and questions, because I think that everyone has a lot to say. And also, I should note that I have less to say than I might normally, because we don't really know everything yet. But what I'm going to talk mostly about is the connection of politics to religion and religious voting blocks. And I'm going to talk about that for three reasons. One is it's my field. So I'm trained as an American religious historian. So the first thing I always think about is what's the connection of religion to the election. The second is we know that religion is often one of the best predictors for how people vote. So if we can understand what happened in terms of religion in the election, then that'll help us figure out what will happen going forward, and perhaps make predictions about 2 and 4 years from now. And then the other reason I think we should look at religion is I think that in the Trump era, there's been a remarkable fusion of nationalism, on the right at least, of nationalism, religious identity, political identity, and that we have to understand sort of why particularly Christian voters turned out in the numbers they did for Trump. So we should note, of course, I mean, like many of you, I'm quite happy Biden won. I am appalled at the number of people who voted for Trump. And so part of this was me spending a lot of time yesterday going through the numbers, trying to figure out why is it that a person who looked from my perspective like a fascist was able to attract the millions of voters he did. So I should give some caveats. What I was doing, and again, it was mostly yesterday because it was based on the numbers I had, was I was looking at survey data and I was looking at polling data. And the big caveat is we know the polls were off. Now, they weren't wrong, and they weren't that far outside of the margin of error, but we know they were off, and they were off 4 years ago. So the particular polls I used, I'm looking at my notes over here, are I used the American Values Survey, which was done in September. That's usually, that's repeated every 4 years, or every 2 years, I think, and that's a telephone survey. It's usually very well thought of. It doesn't just ask about politics and religion, it's more broadly about values and ethics. So I used that data. It was a telephone sample of around 2,500 Americans. I used the exit poll data from the Edison Research, which is the standard one that all of the news surveys, news systems use. I should note, I don't have the thousands of dollars to pay to get access to the raw numbers. So I was using what CNN and ABC and everyone else were pulling out of there. A couple of places had posted, so the New York Times posted a lot of the numbers, so I was able to do that. And then I used a bit of AP and Reuters as well. So that's where I'm drawing this from. All right, so what's the main takeaway? I was not surprised that white evangelicals remain the most important voting bloc. And I think that the fact that it was a nail biter really comes down to the fact that Trump was able to maintain the power he had with white evangelical Christian voters. So I'm guessing everyone knows what I mean by white evangelical Christian, but just in case people need a refresher, generally the way that pollsters or sociologists of religions or historians talk about evangelicals is in one of three ways. One is it's a person who self-represents as evangelical Christian. So people have been doing that since the 19th century. So they would say, I am an evangelical Christian. By that, they generally mean they ascribe to certain ideas, like being a born-again Christian, believing that the Bible isn't inerrant or entirely true, believing they have to spread Christianity, believing that other religions don't have truth within them. There's a whole bunch of things that they mean by that. That's the second way that pollsters or sociologists figure out what evangelical means. We can just ask them, where do you stand on these 5 or 6 things? And if they look like evangelicals, we'll call them evangelicals, even if they don't want to call themselves that. And the third is to ask them what denomination they're part of. So we can say if they're a Southern Baptist, we're going to call them evangelical. If they are part of the Assemblies of God, we'll call them an evangelical. In that case, they're actually a Pentecostal evangelical. If they say they're a non-denominational Christian, we'll call them an evangelical. So that's the other way to do it. So that group is around 16% of the electorate. That has shrunk substantially in the last 10 years. They used to be much higher than that. What is important, though, even though they're only 16% of the electorate, is they tend to turn out in very high numbers, and they also tend to vote as a block. And they did for Trump 4 years ago, and they did for Trump this year as well. They're probably the only substantially large religious group, which we can talk about, that clearly does vote as a block. They're 2 times as likely to support Trump in the lead up to the election based on the poll data than any other Americans were. So 76% of evangelicals supported Trump in the week before the election versus 35% of the general population. So that's a little over twice as much. We should note that compared to other Protestants or Catholics, so other Christians, it was pretty much split down the middle. It looks a lot like the country, whereas evangelicals were really out of step even compared to other Christians in terms of their support for Donald Trump. Their concerns when they were asked by the American Values Survey for what they were concerned about in the election, really, really interesting. I mean, so the numbers are fascinating. When you ask them, what are you concerned about? Why are you going to vote the way you are? The answers evangelicals gave for how they and why they were going to vote the way they were completely out of line with how other Americans answered that question. So the top 3 answers that evangelicals gave for why they were going to vote the way they were in the presidential election were: number 1 was abortion, number 2 was perceptions of voter fraud, and number 3 was Islamic terrorism. No other group of Americans, not even Catholics, who you'd expect might have abortion in the top 3, had abortion in the top 3. So they were completely out of line. The other Americans, by and large, listed the pandemic as first, racial, and then it sort of varied: racial inequality, healthcare, the economy, crime, international standing, things like that. But among some Catholics, actually, abortion hit number 3. It depends who you ask. But it's remarkable that if you were going to do sort of a plot of where Americans stood and what the most important issues were, the clear outliers were evangelicals. I was really struck when I looked at this that they had listed Islamic terrorism as one of the top concerns they had in the election. It's I would say extremely out of keeping with what I have heard in terms of sort of popular discourse in the last year. So I was surprised that was still something that they were so focused on, based on a poll which was taken really just within the last month. So turning from pre-election polls to post-election, what actually happened with evangelicals? 3 to 4 voted for Trump, according to the exit polls. Exit polls are generally pretty reliable. That being said, they can't capture someone who lies. So this is a big issue pollsters have had, is there what's called the shy Trump voter. So a person who will vote for Trump, but either will tell a pollster before or afterwards, no, I didn't vote for Trump. That's called the shy Trump voter. It's often tied to the idea of social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is when you know or you suspect the pollster wants you to answer one way, and so you answer that way even though it's not the truth. The example I often give for that is I very seldom get polled for some reason, but I did get polled once by a peanut butter company, which was polling me about how often I ate peanut butter. And one of the questions was, do you ever eat peanut butter right out of the jar with a spoon? And the social desirability was, I didn't want to say yes, because I don't want people to think of me as the sort of person who eats peanut butter out of a jar with a spoon. But in that case, I did in fact admit the truth, which is yes, indeed, I had done that. But the social desirability bias would have been for me to say, no, of course not. I don't do that. So there's a fear that people might be lying, that they might have said, no, they didn't vote for Trump, when in fact they did. That's probably why the poll numbers are as off as they are. But evangelicals, it seems, actually were not caught up in that. They about 3 out of 4 of them said going into the election they would vote for Trump. 3 out of 4 of them said coming out of voting that they did vote for Trump. It varied somewhat regionally, and this is really interesting. We have good numbers both in Georgia and in Michigan, 2 swing states. Pollsters, by the way, don't tend to do a lot of polls in places like Alabama or Massachusetts, where it's pretty clear everyone knows where the vote's going. So most of our numbers come from the swing states. But in Georgia, where there's a preponderance, particularly of Southern Baptists, 85% of evangelicals, so that's even 10% above the national number, voted for Trump. Whereas in Michigan, where you have a fewer number of Southern Baptists and more non-denominational Christians, it was only 70%. So that was less than the national numbers. Vanessa and I were talking before this started about different ways you can slice and dice the numbers. Since it was such a close election in many states, even a 5% difference in like that could actually help make a major difference. So big takeaway, white evangelicals broke heavily for Trump by about a 75% of them on average voting for Trump. That is about where it was 4 years ago. It's slightly less. The slight difference depends on state and on region, but I would still say as a whole that they were a captured voting bloc by Trump. And I want to talk about why in a bit, but I want to talk about some of the other groups as well first. But we're going to come back to evangelicals because I think that's part of the big story here. For other Christians, the numbers are less easy to parse. So we should note that 64% of registered voters identify as Christian. So if you're doing the math in your head, I said 16% of registered voters were evangelical. So 64% identify as Christian. So the majority of Christian voters are not evangelical. They fall in the other major demographic categories, which would include the mainline Protestants. Mainline Protestants are another set of denominations that tends to be more moderate theologically, but not necessarily moderate politically or socially. And this gets into sort of the history of Christian denominationalism. But when we talk mainline, think groups like the Episcopalians, United Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church USA, Disciples of Christ, groups like that. So they are a major group within that sort of non-evangelical Christian category, as are Catholics, and then Black Protestants are the other sort of main large group. Then there's others as well. There's Eastern Orthodox, for example, but they're too small of numbers to really make much of a difference in the polling. So among those non-evangelical Christians, there's actually very little I can say or we can say at the moment. That's because they tend to be split. In many cases, it's there are idiosyncratic reasons why particular groups are for or against particular candidates, with the exception of Black Protestants. Black Protestants, by and large, did vote for Biden, as one would expect. There, I think it's part of it is religion, but I think the preponderance of it is racial ethnic. So Black Protestants, again, are the exception. You can look at them as a bloc. However, I don't think that it would be correct to say that Black Protestants voted for Biden because of their Protestantism. Rather, they look a lot like other African Americans in the way they voted. Hispanics were incredibly split, and I was just looking at the numbers yesterday. Mexican Americans were not. Mexican Americans, whether they were religious or not, and Hispanic Americans, in terms of religion, tend to fall into either most of them are Catholic, but some are evangelical as well. But we don't tend to count them among the white evangelicals. So among Mexican Americans and Central and Southern American Hispanics, they broke for Biden by pretty large numbers. Cuban Americans were the exception, and that made the difference in Florida. Catholics are interesting. Again, there's not much to say. They're 22% of the electorate. So they're actually the largest Christian single denominational group. There are more Protestants than there are Catholics when you put all the Protestants together. But there are more Catholics than there are any individual Protestant group. So the Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant group, but they're still smaller than Catholics. Catholics do not and have not for decades voted as a bloc. A part of that is inter-Catholic variety. Catholics in America have always been divided by ethnicity. and there's no reason to assume that the Irish Catholic versus Italian Catholic blocs would necessarily vote the same way. But increasingly, it is not those old cultural ethnic distinctions among Catholics. It tends to be that the breakdown comes to be if you look at ask a Catholic how often they attend church. A Catholic who attends church once or more per week was more likely to vote for Trump. A Catholic who attends church less than once per week was more likely to vote for Biden. So it seems to come down to what we would call religiosity. That religiosity index is also tied for Catholics to positions like how do they feel about birth control, about abortion, and proselytization, and other elements that make some forms of Catholic look a lot more like evangelicals. The Catholics who looked demographically like evangelicals tended to vote like evangelicals for Trump. The Catholics who looked unlike that tended to vote for Biden. And it didn't seem to have much of a breakdown in terms of ethnicity or culture, again, with the exception of the Hispanic Catholics. And there it really depended on point of origin. There are lots of other religions, but none of them were large enough for us to get a good enough demographic size at this moment to be able to figure out through polling where they stood. We can say with the relative certitude, even though they're very small numbers, we are very small numbers, that Jews and Muslims broke for Biden at very high rates. What is going to have to happen is in the next month, there are going to have to be some oversampling. So oversampling is when you're going to do polling and you intentionally are trying to get more of a particular group. So not representative of all Americans. You're going to dial the phone numbers where you think you're going to get Jews and Muslims or Sikhs or Hindus or other sort of small minorities. And if you oversample like that, which will probably happen in the next month, we'll be able to have a better idea about how these smaller religious minorities broke. From the numbers we have thus far, and there are a couple of polls that have looked at American Jews in particular, it will not be surprising to you that it looks like Biden got about 80% of the Jewish vote. And among Muslims, it looks to be about the same. There's less good numbers, but it makes intuitive sense that you're not going to get a lot of Muslims to support the guy who put in the Muslim ban. Among South Asians, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, other sort of, these are all small religions in the US, big religions in Asia, but small religions here. We just don't have enough numbers. Intuitively, one would think they generally broke for Biden-Harris. However, there's just not good enough numbers right now for us to say. Probably in the next month, we'll figure it out. Okay, so what are the big takeaways from all of this? The big takeaways, and hopefully you're not bored by all of these numbers, by the way. I was fascinated. Again, I spent like hours looking through these numbers. So if you're bored by all those numbers, here's the big takeaway. Of the large religious voting blocks, it is white evangelical Christians that remained the most solidified, broke clearly for one particular political party, for Trump. The other large religious groups, with the exception of Black Protestants, who again, I believe it's tied more to ethnicity and race than it is to religion. With that exception, it is the white evangelical Christians that really were the story in terms of what happened, why Trump was able to get the numbers he did. At least that's my reading of it with the numbers we have right now. That's my assessment of the quantitative results we have thus far.
Yeah, Ben, I think people are very interested in the numbers, and I'm going to save the questions. And
yeah, I see them.
You know,
good. Yeah, we'll come back. I want to show us one thing. I said I didn't have anything to show us. I'm going to show us one thing. By the way, I'm not trying to bring the ascot back in style. I have neck strain from so much Zoom, so I'm wearing a neck warmer. But I realized you probably thought I was wearing a strange-looking ascots. But like all of you, I spent so much time on Zoom, I'm starting to get neck strain.
Wow.
Anyways, there was a question about Orthodox Jews. I would expect that's that 20%, but it's again, it's we're not going to know until they're able to do the oversampling. I have a good friend from college, actually. He works at Brandeis, and they have a big center there for statistical study of American Jewry, and they're the groups that does it. They know how to do it, and it comes down to, you're going to laugh. They'll look at the white page and look for people with Jewish sounding names, and then they'll look at what zip codes they're in, and they'll call a bunch of numbers in those zip codes. So there's a bunch of ways they do it, and there are problems here and there. In fact, my friend Mika, his name, Mika gave a a talk on the problem with this, and he gave I still remember the name of his talk. It was a rose in bloom by any other name. So the problems of oversampling, of trying to actually survey, because we're 3% of the American population. So if you're going to random dial numbers, that's not going to work. So Orthodox Jews are even smaller, and believe it or not, this is a tangent, but it's an amusing one. There was a study where they were trying to survey American Jews, but they were calling on Saturday. So, so you can see the obvious problem for trying to sample Orthodox. Sorry, it cracks me every time I talk about it, because it's the people who designed these surveys who are not Jewish. It made sense to them, but when someone went to actually do this study, someone should have said, maybe we should use a different day. So that was sort of famous in the lore among sociologists of religion. I was looking at the questions right now. Puerto Ricans broke for Biden. I think it was by around a 2-to-1 ratio. I want to say it was 65 or 66%, something around there. So around 2-to-1 for Puerto Ricans. So that was surprising, because Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico tend to be more conservative. Puerto Ricans in the continental U.S. tend to be more liberal. And I would say that's because they're often treated as immigrants, even though, of course, they are not. They are Americans, but they're often sort of lumped into and they receive much of the same animosity that many other immigrants feel. And people often confuse them for Mexicans in the same. Not that it's nice to slur Mexicans, but the Puerto Ricans are sort of face the same thing. So Puerto Ricans looked much like Central and South Americans in terms of how they acted. Mexican Americans, with the exception of some long-standing Mexican American groups in South Texas, tended to vote heavily for Biden. Again, the exception was there are Mexican American populations that have lived in Texas for longer than Texas has been part of the US. They've been there like 150 years. They tended to go for Trump. And I think there's idiosyncratic reasons for that, having to do with the particular economic concerns in South Texas involving immigration. I think it gets pretty complicated, and it's a relatively small group. I will note, though, that if that group had gone for Biden, he might have won Texas, though. So it's a small group, but, and again, Vanessa and I were talking about this beforehand, there's so many small groups. So that I had mentioned to her the Navajo, for example. The Navajo in Arizona voted so strongly for Biden that if you just look at the numbers that they had, that was enough to tip Arizona. So the way you can slice these numbers, you can get a whole bunch of different groups. You can say, well, that was the group. It's counterintuitive to say, well, there's 4 groups we can say that was the group. Well, we're comparing apples and oranges here. But had Latinos not gone for Biden, he wouldn't have won Arizona. Had the Navajo not gone for Biden, he wouldn't have won Arizona. Had, though, that 5% of evangelicals that was less likely to support Trump now than they were 4 years ago not gone for Biden, he wouldn't have won Arizona. So with these states where the margins are so slim, you can point to about 6 different groups and say, well, that was the group.
So we have 2 questions. One was private chatted to me. How could the evangelical bloc accept President Trump, a serial philanderer, misogynist, non-observant churchgoer who used the church when pushing law and order, standing in front of it, after tear gassing people? And, most people would call this unethical and immoral behavior. This is my question too. Thank you, Bob and Babs and my husband, Arthur. Like, how can they do it?
Yeah. So I think initially it was 4 years ago. There were some evangelicals who voted with their, with their noses up and at a distance for Trump, thinking that although they disagreed with him personally and they thought that he was immoral, they were willing to vote for him because it was between him and Clinton. And many evangelicals had not voted for Trump in the primary 4 years ago for precisely those reasons. So that if we look at the primary numbers, many of them had voted against Trump. But when Trump was selected, if the choice was either Clinton or Trump, they went for Trump for, I think, 2 reasons. One was the push. That is, many evangelicals found Hillary Clinton repulsive. In many cases, that was pure misogyny. It was because she was a woman, she was a liberated woman, she was a liberal woman. and that no matter who she was running against, they would never have voted for her. The other was the pull. Trump very successfully 4 years ago, and even more successfully this year, although not in terms of numbers, voters, but I think in terms of rhetoric, very successfully was able to convince evangelicals that he had their back, and that he would appoint Supreme Court justices and federal judges that would be supportive of what evangelicals want, which is, of course, not just the abolition of abortion, but also to reinstate school prayer, and if not to do that, to support vouchers for Christian schools, to enact religious freedom protections designed so that evangelicals don't have to engage gay and lesbians. The whole bunch of sort of various issues. Maintaining the tax shelters for churches. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues that evangelicals want judges appointed that are on their side. And Trump said, I'll do that. I think that he also really carefully cultivated and very successfully a rhetoric of himself as clothed in Christianity. He actually at one point came out and said that that he identified as a non-denominational Christian, which evangelicals was him saying, I'm like you. Now, why were they willing to? Oh, let me show you something actually. This came across Facebook. This was before the election, but it was, I thought, very prescient. I got this from a colleague who studies evangelicals. You can see here, this is Ivanka, I think. I'm not sure this is actually.
I think that's Melania.
It's Melania. It's Melania. It's Melania. So it's Melania. Kamala Harris over here is stabbing him, and then we have over here. I think this is the media, perhaps, and I think we have a praying Christian, perhaps. And then we have Putin clearly, and Kim, and I'm Erdogan, I think. So we have sort of some dictators over here. The iconography is obvious. It's interesting. I sort of tried to track down where this originally came from, and there were even evangelicals that said this is offensive. This is sinful. But there were plenty of evangelicals who held this up and were reposting this on Twitter and on Facebook as something very, very positive that they were subscribing to. I think this is reflective of what Trump was able to do, which was to make himself appear not just as a Christian, but as emblematic of Christianity, that he became the flag for Christians. I mean, and the raising of Trump flags is, I think, indicative of this. The fact that he was able to say, I am your symbol. And evangelicals they're not any dumber than the rest of us, and they're not unaware that he's a serial philanderer. They simply look past it as irrelevant to the fact that he is the symbol for them. And what does he represent? He represents the things they hold most dear to them. Their sort of ethnic, religious, cultural, national identity, which they see as under siege. I think it's not fair to say it all comes down to racism. We can't separate race from it. The idea of America as a chosen Christian, white, Protestant nation goes very, very deep back to the Puritans. I mean, that was when the Puritans were landing. We tell the Thanksgiving story because that makes us feel nice. But those pilgrims were a tiny minority of the Puritan population settling New England. The story we should be telling is the sermon given by John Cotton, who was one of the most important Puritan settlers arriving in Boston, who preached a sermon called The Divine Right to Occupy the Land, which was entirely about how the Puritans were the new Israel. And much as in the old Israel, and here he's referencing the book of Judges, basically, just as sort of there was a providentially, the other inhabitants of the land were sort of cleared out, so too the Native Americans will be killed off by God, or that we will be given this land. And it's the building up. And of course, we all know the City on the Hill line, which comes from John Winthrop, which is a little more positive, but the idea that this is a special Christian nation protected by God, looked down upon by God. That's the language that we should know. I mean, Reagan did this too. This is the language, very powerful language. But that's the language Trump, he doesn't have the rhetorical power of a Ronald Reagan, but he had the gut ability to make Christians feel like he was tied into that idea. that to vote for Trump was to vote for white Christian Protestant America, in an America which was powerful. It was the shining city on the hill. And to vote against him was to vote for the antithesis of all of that. It's to vote for brown and black America. It's to vote for immigrants. It's to vote for non-Christian America. It's to vote for Muslims. It's to vote for an America which is not a city on a hill, but an America which has problems. So this is why he was so upset, and Republicans were so upset by the idea that America could have systemic racism, or America had ever sinned or made any sort of mistakes. So to hold up Trump was to hold themselves up and to hold up the most powerful mythic understandings of what America is about. That's my reading. So it's a very long answer to a short question, but that's my reading of why evangelicals, who I think it is at our peril for us to dismiss them as idiots. They are well aware that Trump is a philanderer, that there are rape allegations against him, that he very clearly seems to have been committing tax fraud for years. He lies out of his teeth. Evangelicals, by and large, know that. They just don't care. Now, I should say not all evangelicals. Some evangelicals, particularly if they're getting their news from particular sources, think all of that is made up. Let's bracket that. That's another. Then it comes down to where, that's sort of an epistemological question. How do you know what truth is? There's some who just say, well, if I disagree with it, it can't be truth. But I think for many of them, they're well aware of his failings. They simply look past it.
Carol asked, since Jimmy Carter, the evangelicals have been an influential and have they been a consolidated voting bloc? And I'm going to add on to that. Who is the heir apparent to this bloc? And I guess that gets into, and not that you would know, but would you expect Trump to run again in 4 years?
I've been wondering that. I'm trying to figure out what is the next step. I think from what I've seen, I poked around on, I feel icky saying it, like conservative evangelical Twitter feeds for a while, trying to figure out what are they saying. And by and large, what I have not seen is evangelicals doing an about face. Now, it's really early. Trump hasn't even conceded, not that he may never, but at some point, someone's going to have to say something. So at that point, will evangelicals say, mea culpa, we backed the wrong horse? And will they separate from Trumpism? I don't think so. I don't think they will, because evangelicals, first of all, they're shrinking. Evangelical numbers are shrinking. The largest growing voting bloc, if we're going to call it that, I suppose, a religious voting bloc, would be the nuns, the non-affiliated. And the non-affiliated went for Biden by, it was either, I want to say it was around high 60% to Biden. I'd have to look it up, but it's, I did look it up. I can't remember the numbers. Do I have it here? No.
We believe you on the 60%.
Yeah, it's something around that for and in many cases, those non-affiliated are ex-evangelicals. They're usually the children of evangelicals. So evangelicals are shrinking. And I think in a fortress mentality, they're unlikely to disconnect from what is a very viable, very strong current within American culture, and that is Trumpism. So I don't think they're going to break. And what I saw was, when I was looking at Twitter, was evangelical leaders saying this is a temporary setback, that we'll be back. Will it be Trump himself in 4 years? I don't know. Age is probably going to play a consideration. My gut instinct, and I will make the same warning to you all that I make to my students when they ask me these questions. I'm trained as an historian. Historians are very bad at making predictions, right? Everyone's heard this. My assumption will be that 2.5 years from now, President-elect Biden will announce he is not going to run again, and that Kamala Harris is heir presumptive on the left. And my assumption is there's going to be a scramble on the right after the midterm elections. And out of that mess, the evangelicals will coalesce around whoever they think can beat Harris, because Harris is a Black woman, and that is probably that will be a symbol that they can rally against. We know from the sociology, and this is horrible to say, but we know from the sociology of that symbols to rally against are the most powerful way to rally for a cause, is to have someone to be against, and she's going to provide the ideal symbol to rally against. If the Democrats are smart, they'll get Biden to run again in 4 years and resign after a month. because it's going to be it's gonna be easier to run a Biden ticket than it would be a Harris ticket, I think, for that reason. Now, again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong about all this, but my gut tells me that evangelicals are not going to do an about face. However, and I speak now not as an academic, but as a liberal American Jew, I am warmed to see that their numbers continue to shrink, and that many young evangelicals are repulsed by the deep connections of evangelicalism to politics. I have plenty of evangelicals in my classes at Lake Forest College. They tend to be apolitical, and the ones that are political are pretty evenly split between left and right, but they often tend to not want to connect it to their religiosity anymore. That they see this as a bad bargain that was made in the 80s, moral majority, that this tying of evangelical Christian identity to politics was a mistake. The evangelical left, I do not think will ever make much of a move. They're damned if they do, damned if they don't. They can't. They want to embrace parts of the left, which makes sense to them, things like racial justice, equality, climate change, but they are unwilling and unable to accept gay and lesbian Christians or support abortion or birth control. So they're never going to make their way into the liberal mainstream, the progressive evangelicals. I don't think they're ever going to have any honest effect, and which is sad to say, because I have friends who are progressive evangelicals, but they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. All right, how's that? Again, a long answer to a short question.
It was a complex question, and I appreciate all the detail. And I think that I would imagine, and we had a couple questions about it, that we all appreciate that, because for 4 years we were all like, what the hell is going on here? And you make me go, and I can see it. We have another question. Was there a difference between mail-in voters and those who voted in person?
In terms of the religious breakdown, yes. So I should say that a lot of our numbers on that come from there were telephone polls done by Edison Research. So they were able to do about 50,000 exit polls, like in person. And they did about 20,000 telephone polls of mail-in voters. Now, as we all know, telephone polls, there's a huge problem with them, because I don't know about you, I don't answer my phone if I don't know the number. So these things are getting increasingly unreliable. Based on the bad numbers we have, show that the main difference is Democrats broke heavily towards absentee mail-in balloting, and that's because their Democratic leadership said vote by mail, and the Republicans did not, because Trump said don't vote by mail. And therefore, in terms of the religious voting blocks, it all came down to whether if they were already leaning Republican, they tended not to. If they were leaning Democrat, they tended to. But it didn't seem to have any connection to ethnic, racial, religious, or other demographic, gender considerations. It came down to if they were, if they listened to Trump, they didn't want to vote by mail. If they listened to Biden or didn't listen to Trump at all, then they were more likely to vote by mail. With a few exceptions, and the exceptions being some of the snowbirds. So Arizona was interesting, and Florida were interesting, because there you had people who really had to vote by mail if they weren't in the state where they were legally voting. And so that broke the pattern. So, but that's relatively small numbers with the exception of those two states, because that's where you have the large number of snowbirds, is Florida and Arizona. But again, those are, and if you look at the breakdown numbers by voting there, those are the only places where you have, Arizona has more Republicans than Democrats voting by mail. Florida's, I think, about even, but I mean, Florida's its own weird case. I'm somewhat stunned Florida went red. I thought that they were, I had discounted the degree to which Cuban Americans really were in Trump's column, because I thought it would be close, but I was, and I should say, not just me, the polls were way off too. That was the only surprise for me. Nothing else really surprised me.
I was also surprised, although everyone said you shouldn't be surprised about that. And I think it was the Cubans and the Venezuelans. And
Yeah,
he targeted them with very scary commercials down there, which we never saw. Can it be forecast how you talk about the smaller voting groups? Are they growing or not growing, and how will they affect future elections? And we do have one comment that Trump will not be allowed to run in 2024 because he will be in jail or in Russia. Excellent
They're not,
comment, Carol.
right? The smaller voting blocks, well, I mean, so they're all growing, but the question is, are they growing in? I mean, they're all growing in raw numbers. Even Jews. I mean, we often tend to like be, paranoid that we're shrinking. In raw numbers, we're growing out. We can credit the Orthodox having like 8 children for that. But the in terms of percentages, no. In terms of percentages, the share of the electorate of what I would call sort of the small minority religions, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, all of those are really going to hover between 1 and 3% each. That's because the fastest growing is Hispanic, Latinx, Catholic, and Protestant. They're growing at a much faster rate. So raw numbers, yes. I mean, there's going to be more Jews in 4 years than there are now if the trends continue. There'll be more Sikhs and more Hindus and more Buddhists and more Jains and more. I know I'm forgetting some of them. Zoroastrians not. They're shrinking. Zoroastrians don't accept conversion either. So that group's going down. But most, and I have no idea about Shinto. I mean, some groups, they're so small you can't count. Yeah, in terms of share though of raw numbers, they are not likely to make much of a difference in 2 or 4 years. With some geographic exceptions, as we know, there's like 3 little blocks in the country where Jews make a substantial a difference, and we're in one of them. The other 2 are New York and Florida. So there are some little places where you have, there are some. I mean, I live in one of the 3 places where, demographically speaking, Jews are a voting bloc, but it's outside of Highland Park and outside of like the Miami-Dade region in New York. You're not going to find a huge difference Jews are going to play.
Yeah. Interesting. We also had a question about women. How could women, especially white Christian women, vote for Trump? I would layer onto that college-educated women, and how did women in general break this year?
Women in general, so white women voted for Trump, and they voted for Trump in approximately the same numbers as they did 4 years ago. Some states more, some states less. Some. Let me look. Let me remember for evangelical Christian women, they voted in almost exactly the same percentages for Trump. Now Trump's numbers actually up. The raw numbers it was higher, but the percentage breakdown was about the same as it was 4 years ago, within the margins of error, I would say. I mean, you have to. The polls are all sort of wonky, but I wouldn't make a claim with a couple of percentages here and there. Basically, it looks like he was able to maintain the same lead he had with white Christian women, white evangelical women in particular. White Catholic women all over the map. And then among non-white women, the story is reversed. I mean, you could again say that Biden won because of the African-American women. And he did say it. He said it yesterday night. Again, it depends how you cut it. But that I remember he emphatically pounded remember that was the most emphatic part of his talk last night, which was I think you can cut the numbers other ways too, but that's a fair way to cut them. It was African-American women that brought him over the edge in Detroit, in Milwaukee, and in Atlanta. And if you take and in Philadelphia, you take those away. Now, we should credit African-American men as well. They just tend to vote in less numbers than African-American women. So how could women vote for Trump is an interesting question. It's mostly white women, mostly white evangelical women. And I would go back to everything I said about evangelicals. It's not a unique election, but it is interesting the degree to which for evangelicals, the economy, international relations, even a pandemic that we're living under didn't enter into the equation for them. What they cared about were the central symbolic cultural issues that drive evangelicals. And that is opposing abortion, and that is school prayer, and that is protection from the other, from Islamic terrorism. I mean, when I hate to go back to the same thing, but when I looked at those numbers and thought they're afraid of what? I mean, of Islamic terrorism? I mean, if I were an Islamic terrorist, I wouldn't bother with the U.S. right now. We're going to kill ourselves with a pandemic. I mean, what do you have to do? Just leave us to ourselves. We're destroying ourselves. So it looked bizarre. I mean, who would possibly put? I mean, anyone with any quantitative skills would say Islamic terrorism versus pandemic. I mean, which one should we be concerned about? But they're not thinking quantitatively. They're not thinking which one is more dangerous to me and you in terms of, or to our society. They're thinking symbolically. The pandemic has no symbolic threat to evangelicals. In fact, the opposite. If you're listening to Trump, he has pitched it where the pandemic has no symbolic threats whatsoever. It's simply a flu which will go away. It's don't worry about it. It's here and it's gone. Yeah, people will die, but don't worry about it. What's dangerous is that foreign other, that brown-skinned, wrong religioned other. They're what's dangerous. And so I was surprised, but not surprised to see that's what they were worried about. That says a lot about why they voted for Trump.
Ed has his hand up. Ed,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry to keep going, Ed. I did see your hand pop up. Yeah.
Professor Zeller, just to take a breath for a moment and change the topic, is that beautiful scene behind you Lake Forest College?
It is, yes. Lake Forest College.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Ed taking us off a little bit here. So I have a couple of questions about, can you share any insights about the military vote, about, Brenda had one about, different professions voting for Trump or Biden, and from Sandy Kaminsky, many people were voting for Trump with their 401ks in mind. And, this includes 25% of local Jews that we know. Will this continue? So kind of putting, pushing out military money.
I was surprised to what extent for many voters, economic issues did not come to the forefront, with the exception of the perception that Biden would somehow support socialism. And again, you mentioned the Venezuelan Americans, so that's in Cuban Americans. But with that exception, it's certainly, numbers in the 20% wouldn't surprise me, but for the majority of Americans, that it was not an economically driven election. In terms of the military, I actually can't say anything at all, because for military overseas, in many cases, those ballots either haven't been counted or are not going to be segregated such that we can know who voted where. And there's just not enough polling data, or any polling data I'm aware of military overseas. Military stationed here, you'd be able to figure it out. Someone may be looking at it, I'm just not sure of who. It wouldn't be tough, actually. You would just look at, you could look at the precinct for Fort Sheridan. You could probably figure out the military housing there is all one precinct. Now, you're not going to catch voters who are going to vote absentee out of state, though. Again, they're going to be, so if you're stationed here, but you're an Ohio resident, then you're not going to capture it in terms of the Lake County votes. So I don't know. It's a long way of answering. I don't know. However, I have my gut instinct is that it's probably fewer for Trump now than there were 4 years ago, or there were historically for Republicans. Military tends to lean conservative. However, military has become increasingly diverse. And because the military has been stretched so thin, particularly in the last 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, that old assumption may not be correct. But this is, I have no numbers to back me up. That is merely my gut says that they're going to look more like the rest of the country than they will like a distinct bloc. It is also possible Jill Biden has been explicit in her public discourse about being a military mom and in reaching out to the military. It is possible that swayed some military voters to vote for Biden. We just don't know. And I'm not sure we ever will know, because it's going to be really hard to capture those numbers.
And of course, again, with Trump calling people in the military losers and why would they go into it, you would think that would affect it, but it may or may not.
You'd think, but then I mean, there's also, and I showed you that image of Trump, as Jesus, but there's also Trump as Rambo. That's another one. Is Trump with, he's got like AK-47s in every arm, and well, two arms. But the sort of the idea of Trump as warrior and Trump as American warrior is also a really powerful image as well. So, yes, rationally, why would someone vote for someone who called you a loser? However, if you feel like he represents you, that he is the warrior, and that Biden's a wimp, then that would be a reason to vote against. The scholars, you all probably know this too. We call it cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you have two things which clearly, I mean, the guy calls you a loser, but also you think that he represents you. People have way around the dissonance. I mean, the person who coined the term, Leon Festinger, the model of cognitive dissonance was it's always resolvable. I mean, that was his theory, was that yes, there's cognitive dissonance, but it's always resolved by people. It's resolved in really weird ways, but people are able to resolve it.
Rabbi Ike says a book that changed the way that he thinks about elections is The Myth of the Rational Voter by Brian Kaplan, a nonpartisan look at why all of us vote under the influence of false beliefs.
Yeah.
So we also had another question about, are you able to discern how former refugees voted?
I am not able to discern that again. So what's often really troublesome for those of us who are scholars is our questions do not align with the questions that interest pollsters. Pollsters are paid by the news organizations, and they're going to poll based on what the news organization wants to buy. The questions that interest me are, first of all, not just Michigan and Florida. I want to know what's going on in Oklahoma. I want to know what's going on in Rhode Island too. But that's one of the questions which is intensely interesting, but I don't think that we're ever going to have the right numbers for. Again, you could do it. If you want to do that, you're going to have to, you could oversample that group, but you'd have to get a grant. You're going to write a grant to Mellon and you'd get, or Carnegie, and you could figure it out. But maybe someone will, we just don't have the data yet.
I mean, again, I think not that the Cubans and Venezuelans in Florida are refugees, but they are immigrants, and that block made a difference, I think. I mean, I'm just watching television. You're the one who has at least some of the data, for goodness sakes. So, and the evangelical bloc does not admit to keeping America white in their decision to vote for Trump.
So what's interesting is I think some of them when pushed them to shove would admit it. I mean, and those are the card-carrying racists. Many of them aren't even aware that the rhetoric they're using is racist to the core. To them, it's just Christian. But their idea of Christianity is so based on a particular sort of mythic valuation of white Protestant America that they're not able to discern the way in which it is racist. It is simply Christian to them. And to use a non-political example of this, so the famous example in DC when there was one of the first public installations of a Black Jesus image. It was in an African-American church, and there was a Black Jesus. And people were aghast, and they said, how dare you do this? It's anathema, literally anathema, formally anathema. And the response of historians and was to say, well, do you really think Jesus looked Norwegian? I mean, the images are there. Do you really? This is probably closer to how he looked. But the idea that many white Christians Americans had is that Jesus looks like Warner Sallman's famous image of Christ, right? You can see it down at Methodist Temple, downtown Chicago. I think that's one of the originals. You went there, but it's that image we've all seen of sort of the the white hazy Christian Jesus, and it isn't that they think of themselves as racist. It's just they've tied Christianity to a white Christian identity. Look in the background of those images of those sort of that Warner Sallman sort of 1950s Jesus stuff, and you'll note that he's not in Israel. He's in like Kansas. I mean, if you look at like what's in the background, it's like the Rocky Mountains and like horses and stables. I mean, it's like Thomas Kincaid Jesus. There again, there's a reason for that. It's because within evangelical American Christianity, white evangelical Christian America, the fusion of Christianity with their identity is so strong. To call into question is heretical. So I don't think that most evangelicals are explicit card-carrying racists. Some are, but I think many of them have simply imbued a worldview, which is at its core racist without understanding it. No, I mean, there are the exceptions. I mean, I don't know about many of you. I went to the counter protest was the month ago in Highland Park where that Lake Bluff militia showed up, and you had card carrying racists there. I mean, there were people who were, they were white power nationalists. I mean, that is the exception. But there were also people who were so tied up in them. There was this. I remember this lady. She was wrapped head to toe in the American flag, and she had a NRA sign. I remember, and to her, that was the idea of separating Jesus from guns wouldn't have occurred to her. If you actually read the Christian Gospels, I'm not sure how you'd ever get that message. I mean, there's an actual line where he says to Peter, "Put your sword away." I mean, if you've read the actual Christian Gospels, he's not quite a pacifist, but he's on the pacifist side. But again, that is not the model that white Protestant Christians have. White evangelical Christians. I shouldn't say all Protestants.
So I have a couple of things. They're coming in all over here. Rabbi Ike, who's from Florida, is there any way to track the former felons who got back the right to vote in Florida?
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone did though. I hope they did. I'm hoping that would be some numbers to look at. I haven't seen that. I was using the national survey numbers though from Edison, which does the big exit polls. Some of the Florida papers might have done their own exit polling. That'd be a good question. I don't know.
And then back to the, somebody wanted to know about the Russian immigrants, and another person, I find it impossible to understand how Latinos could vote for Trump after what he did to people at the border, and how Jews could consider voting for someone who's known to encourage white supremacy. How can you comment on this disconnect?
Yeah. So I have a colleague in Texas. She's Latina herself, but she studies Latinx Christianity. And one of the main points she has made in her, she's been interviewed with people, and is that while Hispanic Catholics may be a voting bloc, or Mexican Americans may be a voting bloc, while Pentecostal Venezuelans may be a voting bloc, Latinos as a whole are not. That you have to break it down by particular cultural, ethnic, religious identity groups, and that's the mistake we make when we say, how could Latinos do this, Latinos do that? So the group she studies in particular are Pentecostal Latinos, and for them, that is some of the driving reasons they vote the way they do look remarkably similar to other evangelicals. Not exclusively, but in terms of how they tend to vote, they're more like evangelicals than they would like other non-evangelical Hispanics. And those are the Pentecostal studies. So the answer may be that particular religious theological issues drove them, issues like abortion or school prayer or school vouchers. It is also the case that not all Latinos identify with other Latinos as part of the same group. That there are many Cubans and Venezuelans we've mentioned already, but there's many Chicanos, people who are Hispanics who've been here in America for a while, who don't identify with immigrants and don't identify with other people from the same country where their great-grandparents might have come from. In the same way in which I do not necessarily identify with Lithuanians, even though my great-grandparents came from Lithuania. I don't identify with Poles in the same way another grandparent came from Poland. I mean, it's not that I'm unaware that I am, Lithuanian and Polish and Russian, Turkish ancestry. It's just that I don't have, I don't really identify with it. In the same way, a Chicano, so the term Chicano always refers to American-born, American-identified Hispanics, a Mexican-American in particular. They don't necessarily identify with Mexican immigrants in the same way. And if their generations, if they'd been here 3-4 generations, they don't see themselves as immigrants, they don't see themselves as part of the same group. And again, it's at our peril to assume that they necessarily do. In the same way, you wouldn't assume that that all Jews or all people of Eastern European descent would.
Yeah. I have another question. How do you feel about the election of Biden will affect foreign relations? And I'm going to layer on. And how do you think, after yesterday, really, it's been like 24 hours.
Yeah.
You know, how do, you know, foreign countries and our allies and how's everybody looking at us now?
Well, one of the things I did yesterday, not just to prepare for this, out of pure interest, was to look at how foreign leaders were responding. Now it varied between the extremely measured. If you look at Trudeau's, I think he tweeted a response. It is the most careful, measured thing you can imagine. You have to read entirely between the lines to find anything of value whatsoever. Others were explicit. So Mayor Khan of London, who has been fighting verbally with Trump since they've been in office, said he looks forward to building bridges, not walls. So I mean, it's the response has been clearly in support of Biden, which is not surprising given that Trump has withdrawn us from Paris Accords, from I think the WHO, from sort of implied he doesn't want to be part of NATO anymore. I mean, so the Norwegians came out and said how happy they were that Biden was elected. I mean, there's a reason for that. This is so I think from what I have seen, what's really interesting though is the Ayatollah in Iran commented on how broken American democracy is based on Trump's actions. This may be the first time I ever have anything to say positive about the Ayatollah. But Trump's attacks on voting and on democracy say something really sad about American democracy. And it empowers those who are opposed to us. So that's, it is worrisome that in some ways, I'll just end in there. It's the first time I've read something that Ayatollah's tweeted and said, well, you got a point there. That his attacks on democracy show we have some problems.
Yeah, you know what? Who would have known? Who could have predicted that that's, we're coming towards the end of our hour? Is that how we would end? Please check in the chat. Rabbi talked about the different Hispanic groups and how they get to fast track and so on, and why they might be a little bit different. You're getting a lot of thank yous. I would be remiss. There is a mystery Maccabee gift exchange up to $15. So there's the link for that. All of our classes are started up this week. Oh, Marilyn, you had one last comment?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, with the universities closed, how do you perceive without student participation on campuses and without having voting direction by professors and by students, how did that affect the voting this year? And how many, did most of the students vote by mail, or how did they, what do you know about that?
I can tell you anecdotally. So I happen to teach on Tuesdays. So I said to my students, I said, if you're voting, just tell me you're voting. You don't have to come to class. So I was a blanket. I would say in my morning class, I had about 25 students in that class. I think I had about a third of the students said they were out voting that morning. That they wouldn't be in class. And for the people who showed up, it's out by Zoom. I'm teaching by Zoom. So the 2/3 that showed up, I asked, hey, did you already vote? And pretty much everyone was nodding. Now, again, I'll go back to what I started with. There's the social desirability bias. You're not going to say, oh, no, I didn't vote when your professors said, I was clearly implying I want you to vote. Now, I'm always very careful not to be partisan in my classes, but I was very clear that I want everyone to vote. So it sure seemed like pretty much all of my students had voted. Now, again, about a third of them in person and the other 2/3 early or by mail. That's completely anecdotally based on one sample of 25 people at Lake Forest College. So any pollster would tell you that is not a representative sample. That's what I found in my Tuesday morning class.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, Ben, thank you so much. Next week, we have Eugene Finnerman, our own also. He will be doing the Jewish Hall of Inadvertent Fame. You're going to want to come next Sunday morning for that. Ben, we can't thank you enough. We will have you back. Not only are you the chair of the Adult Enrichment Committee, but I love your past two presentations, and just so glad that we can share that we're all here this morning and able to talk and discuss. And I feel like we were in person. I don't know if Hubie and Elaine were the only people with lox and bagels, but get your lox and bagels, come on down on Sundays, and we'll see you. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Professor Zeller. Thanks,
Oh,
Vanessa.
And Mary Soloff. As Mary said, thank you. Mary Soloff is also the adult ed enrichment chair, and you'll
Sure.
see from her in Readers Theater in a few weeks. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
It was very enlightening.
Thank you. Thank you. It's next time I speak, hopefully I'll have more than 3 days to figure out what I'm going to say. That was
Oh, well, you did
stressful.
great. You did great.
As
Thank you.
Vanessa knows, what am I going to say? Well, I don't know.
I know. All right, be well, everyone. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.